Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappelle. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers. On this episode, we're discussing the magical realism film Pan's Labyrinth, and then we'll end with a critique of One Lucky Author's Query. And just as a reminder, you can now support the podcast on Patreon, where you can read the queries we critique, plus get lots of other bonus content. It's easy to find. Just go to patreon.com/storychatradio.
Here come the spoilers. This movie starts with a brief prologue in voiceover that tells us about a princess who escaped from an underground kingdom to see the world above, and her father, the king, who remained hopeful that she would return one day. So the main story starts in 1944 Spain with 10-year-old Ophelia, who travels with her very pregnant mother, like super pregnant, to the old mill where Ophelia's stepfather, Vidal, is stationed with his army troops. Vidal is a truly awful person and really only cares about his wife as like being the vessel for his child. So that first night, Ophelia is woken by a fairy, which leads her to a labyrinth in the woods nearby. And at the center of it, she meets the faun, who looks really freaking cool.
Really cool.
He tells her she's the princess from the prologue and that she must complete 3 tasks before she can return. Ophelia agrees to the tasks, and her fairy tale story is woven into the story of what is happening with all of the adults in the old mill, which is primarily Vidal, Ophelia's mother, the doctor who tends to her, and then a housekeeper. Vidal is the actual worst in every possible way. Mm-hmm. And Ophelia's mother is not doing well during her pregnancy. It's thought that this is at least in part because of her traveling during this late stage of her pregnancy. So Ophelia meets several strange and magical creatures who become central to her story and lead her through the trials of this old labyrinth. On successful completion of her tasks, the faun returns to Ophelia and tells her to bring her baby brother into the labyrinth. Obviously, this is after her mother delivers. Mm-hmm. Vidal pursues her. The faun tells Ophelia that opening the portal to the underworld requires the blood of an innocent and suggests a few drops of her baby brother's blood. But, like any good child would, Ophelia refuses to harm her basically newborn brother. When Vidal finds her, he takes the baby from her and then fatally shoots poor little Ophelia. The housekeeper takes the baby from Vidal, and then one of the rebels kills him. The movie ends with drops of Ophelia's blood falling down the center of the spiral stone staircase onto an altar. Ophelia then appears in a golden throne room. The king of the underworld says that she passed the final test, which was to choose to spill her own blood rather than that of her baby half-brother. And then the movie ends with a voiceover epilogue that explains Ophelia eventually became ruler of that realm and was beloved by her people. Carly, what did you think of the movie?
I love this movie. I feel like we should just do all the Guillermo del Toro movies, which I know some others are already on our list, so...
Right. We just have to spread them out.
I mean, like every other month, maybe.
Maybe like 2022 can be the year of Guillermo del Toro, and we'll just do all his movies until we run out.
Okay. I'm into it. I might have
some of them are pretty scary.
I know, I was just going to say, I might have a lot of nightmares, but they're pretty, so I'm into it. But no, I loved how it made the magical feel real, which I guess is the point of magical realism a little bit. But it just felt really possible. And I feel like I've kind of missed that like connection to the possibility of magic that I used to have when I was a kid. And I feel like this movie gives you that kind of back where it's possible.
Yeah.
But it's beautiful and dark and scary and whimsical, and I don't have anything bad to say. The only thing I will mention is that my husband was so mad with Ophelia for eating those grapes when she went into one area where it was like, go steal this thing, just whatever you do, don't eat anything. And then, of course, she ate some grapes, even though she had, like, fairies trying to push it out of her mouth. And she's just like, it's fine. And he's like, why? Like, she knows. She's old enough to know that this is wrong and she shouldn't do it. And it's a bad idea. He was mad about it for, like, a couple days, I think. So, oh, well. But it is the most fairy tale moment of the whole story of the kid actually doing the one thing they were told not to do. But I think in particular, I loved kind of the open-ended ending, where you can kind of choose for yourself whether or not you think the magic was real all along, or if she's just a little girl that made up this whole thing. Was it all her imagination? Was it real? Whatever. But I liked not knowing whether, or like getting to decide for myself whether or not she really was a princess that didn't die and got to go to her kingdom, or was it all real and this is just a heartbreaking story. I like the choice.
Yeah.
I like that kind of open-ended, vague ending. What do you think?
Every time I think about this movie, because this is not my first time seeing it, I just think about how sad. It's so sad.
Yeah.
I
forgot how sad it was, I will say.
Yeah. I think I have a harder time with sad than scary, because sad feels so much more real to me. Like, in my own life, I have been desperately sad many more times than I've been, like, desperately scared, you know?
Totally.
So it's definitely like that emotional connection, empathy thing. But yeah, this movie is just such a perfect combination of so many elements. I love the fairy tale element because of how it blends so perfectly with the harshness of Ophelia's real life. And that even this fairy tale is not lighthearted. It's very dark, even scary sometimes, just like a good fairy tale really should be, in my opinion.
100%.
I mean, when you look at, like, their origins and how they came about, like, fairy tale should be kind of scary. Can you imagine, like, the Disney version of this?
It would be so bad.
I know.
I don't want to imagine it. Why'd you do that to me? Oh.
So, yeah, if you like Neil Gaiman-style dark fairy tales like The Ocean Down the Lane or Neverwhere, you'll really love this movie. And, of course, it has that Guillermo del Toro flair to the imagery. And let's talk about Doug Jones for a moment, shall we? He plays two parts in this movie. The faun, who's almost benevolent, and then the pale man, who is definitely not benevolent, and in fact is super creepy.
So creepy.
Yeah, and he's also the same actor who played, like, the main character, the fish guy, in The Shape of Water.
Okay.
And he was in Hocus Pocus.
Who is he in Hocus Pocus?
He's like the dead guy. It's like
with
one
his
witch's
lips.
like ex-boyfriend that they bring back to life.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's him. Like, he has.
Oh, he's awesome.
Yeah, so go watch all the Doug Jones movies.
Okay.
Because he's fabulous. And I think he's worked with Guillermo del Toro on a lot of his movies.
I mean, sounds like it.
We'll find out next year.
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, yeah, loved this movie. Really enjoyed watching it again with that more analytical eye. I always think that's a lot of fun. So what was something that this movie does well that writers can use in their own work?
All right. I think we're going to go with deep POV.
I agree.
Like, definitely it has such a good deep point of view. I mean, it does a lot of other things really well too, because it's an excellent movie, but we've already talked about most of those topics and I don't think we're ready to repeat any of them yet. So Definitely deep POV. But it does it exceptionally well. So we get to understand Ophelia so well and how she sees the world, which is kind of what I was talking about earlier. We see things how she sees them. Mm-hmm. She sees these fairy tale magical moments, so we get to see those fairy tale magical moments. We're deep into her point of view, and that shows us things in a vastly different way than if we were in someone else's point of view. We see, like, the mandrake root that looks like a wailing baby instead of seeing, like, a bit of regular root that you could just dig up. We see fairies instead of big insects. We see a magical doorway instead of a chalk outline on a wall. If we were, like, in her mother's perspective, we wouldn't see any of the magic. But because we're in the POV of a small child that loves fairy tales, we're able to see all of these things. Mm-hmm. If we were in, like, a more of a bird's eye view, we would see those things as ourselves, and whether or not we see the magic would be up to us as viewers in a way. I know that's a little meta and technically impossible, but that's kind of the meaning behind it. But with that deep POV, we get to see this magical world through the eyes of the main character, through the eyes of a child. We put ourselves into her shoes instead of watching it from afar or from above or from someone else's perspective.
Right. I think it does create a sense of, the reason it works so well in this movie is because it creates that sense of, like, not really knowing, like you were saying, not really knowing, like, what is real and what is imagination, because all of it is real to her.
Exactly.
And so because we don't see the events of her storyline through anyone else's perspective, like, there's not any other adults around or anything until the end.
Right.
So we never really know, like, how much of it is real, how much of it is, like, objective truth, if there is such a thing. Mm-hmm. We won't get into that.
Right, because, like...
No existential crises this month, Carly.
Oh, come on. I love them. But, like, when we see, like, the only time her magic possibly really interacts with anyone is when it interacts with Vidal. Like, like, when he pulls out the mandrake root, but also at the end when he shows up and she's talking to the fawn and he doesn't see it.
Yeah.
But he's also Vidal and we hate him, and he's a grumpy old adult who's not going to see the magic even if it's real.
Right.
So it's
like,
kind of...
does that mean it's not real and it's just in her imagination? Or does it just mean that he's a horrible human being and just can't see the magic?
Doesn't deserve to see the magic.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So, exactly. I completely agree. It's one of those things where, like, we just can't know because we're in her head.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, so I think that's why it works so well in this movie, I think. And it really just deepens all of that sense of magic and imagination. Mm-hmm. In terms of deep point of view, that is pretty popular right now. And it's been, mm-hmm. I think, the most popular narrative mode for quite a while in publishing. And any point of view can be deep, whether that's first, second, or third. I know a lot of authors get feedback about needing a deeper point of view and wonder, like, what does that even mean? Mm-hmm. I think deep point of view is one of those phrases that we kind of throw around a lot in publishing, but can be very difficult to understand until you really, like, you have to wrap your head around it. I remember mm-hmm. having to really wrap my head around it. So deep point of view is a step further than traditional limited point of view, which is what we sort of think of as being the opposite of omniscient. In deep point of view, the author tries to create kind of the sense that the reader is experiencing the story in the same way the narrator experiences the story. It means we really have to limit how much filtering is done in terms of the language itself. So the author should more or less be invisible. Mm-hmm. In other words, and I promise we're going to get more into what this means on a practical level, because I feel like I'm just throwing a whole bunch more woo-woo stuff at you.
You should be invisible. Do you get
right?
it?
So, in other words, everything is shown through the lens of the narrator's mind, what they experience through their senses, how they react emotionally, mentally, and viscerally, how they process new information they receive, how those reactions highlight their emotional wound and motivation, and then how that connects to their external actions and decisions. I know, Carly, it'll make you really happy for me to mention that deep point of view means that the narrator is unreliable, because everything is so close to what they think and feel that they aren't really able to be objective. So, whereas an omniscient narrator, in theory, is completely objective, then, when we get into really deep point of view, it is completely subjective.
Yeah, so it's like right now how if we're in my POV, I'm like so excited because Jenny is practically quoting me and talking about how really awesome and smart I am. But objectively, an omniscient narrator would be like, Jenny gives a piece of advice that is accurate.
Good example, Carly.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. And deep POV, I think at least, is so popular because it forms like an emotional connection between the reader and the protagonist. So it becomes easy to pull the reader into the book. It grows that connection so that readers feel like they're on the journey with the narrator, not just hearing about it. It's kind of the difference of like being on the adventure versus someone telling you about the adventure after the fact. So deep POV, it also adds depth to the story because we can understand all of the layers that go into that adventure or story. We get to understand like the decision making that the character is going through. We can feel all of their emotions. We get an inside look into why the story happens a certain way and not just that it does happen that way. Basically, it's more interactive. Readers get to feel engaged in the story by understanding not only what is happening, but why and how it is happening. They get to interact with the story on another level because they dig into these layers of understanding and forge these connections really closely. And but without deep POV, we have a distance from the story that makes all of these things a little bit more difficult to create. It's harder to forge that emotional connection if we're not seeing inside the emotions. We're just looking at them from afar. So it's not that you can't forge those connections. It's just much, much harder. And there's that distance that you kind of have to contend with.
Right. So I think one of the things that authors ask me a lot is how to decide if their story should be written in deep point of view. So I think one way to think about this is how does an author decide if deep point of view is best for their particular story? And there are a lot of things really to take into consideration with that. One is consider industry conventions for your genre and age category. So, for example, contemporary young adult fiction is very often first person, which should always be deep point of view, or a deep third person point of view. It's really uncommon to have a YA contemporary that's omniscient. That's not to say that it can't be, but it is one thing to take into consideration. Deep point of view is great for fun, quirky characters that like you want to get a lot of their quirks and personalities into the narrative itself, or like characters who may not fit a specific social norm, so that we can really get to see what's going on inside of them. It can also be really helpful when you want the reader to know things that the protagonist hides from other characters. So again, like when we're inside a character's head, we know everything that they're going through. We know what they're thinking and feeling, and we know what they're hiding, the things they're lying about. So that's another reason that deep point of view can be really helpful. from an author's perspective, if you really love digging into characters' thoughts and feelings, getting to know them well, then deep point of view can be something that you just really enjoy writing and that you might really connect with. If you want your reader to identify really strongly with your main character, I don't think there's anything better for that than a nice deep point of view.
Yeah.
And then lastly, deep point of view is really best for stories that only have one or maybe two narrators, because of how much the reader needs to be able to engage with that character through deep point of view.
Yeah, agreed. So, how do you deepen a POV in revisions? What do you need to look for? So, first of all, use a strong voice. Show us who your character is. Basically what Jenny said. It's really good for those quirky, fun characters who you really want your reader to get to know. Make us feel like we understand them on a really, really deep level. You don't want the character to be a stand-in for the reader. You want the reader to dig into the psyche of your character instead. So you want to create that really strong voice through filters. How does your character view something in a way that is specific to them? You can go listen to our entire podcast episode on voice to help with that. But don't be afraid of things like figures of speech or swearing, personal interests that they relate to. All the details and descriptions come from the POV character's observations. So, what does your character notice when they walk into a room? They don't notice every detail, but they'll notice specific things first. Like, if I walk into someone's house I've never been in their house before, I always notice if they have books. If they have books on the shelves, if there's books anywhere. But I don't notice if, like, their crowd molding is done correctly and properly. But somebody else totally would notice if that's installed correctly. Then you want to show us your character's internalized thoughts. What are they thinking about in the midst of the action or conversation? If someone says something snarky, do they notice it? Does it annoy them, or do they brush it off because they've spent years dealing with this person? Those kinds of things are all going to dictate how your character reacts, and we're going to get their internalized thoughts on it. So, like, right now, Jenny is probably thinking, oh my God, Carly totally used this example because she thinks I'm snarky. And that would be some great internalized thoughts.
Actually, I was thinking that I'm pretty sure that the only reason we ever kind of became friends is because we started showing our snarky sides.
It's true. That's a nicer. See, that's also a very good internalized thought that gives background information on your character while showing their personality. But so what judgments and opinions does your character have about the world around them and as the plot enacts around them? So the connection between the main character and the reader should basically be that of, like, a really, really close best friend. You know, like that friend you tell everything to without fear of their judgment.
So me, because
yes,
I'm that best friend for you.
Yes, you've always judged me, but I don't care. It's that friend that you talk to when you're annoyed or sad. That friend that's there for you on your journey. So, like, the reader is that friend to the character. The character tells them everything. Not to say that they can't keep secrets from the reader, because we all kind of lie to ourselves or lie to our best friends sometimes. Don't read into this, Jenny.
Too late.
But it needs to be done in a very specific way.
Okay.
So,
first, I need to pause for a second. As soon as we're done recording this, I need you to give me, like, an itemized list of all of the things that you've lied to me about or hidden from me.
Okay.
All right.
Yep. I can do that. First thing on this list, I lied that I would make you a list. Anyway, so your reader is your character's judgy best friend, or your character's the judgy best friend to the reader. And then to get more into deep POV, you want to limit, like, dialogue tags and filter words and passive voice, but we can get to that in a bit.
Yeah. No, that's
I
think
can
a very...
Jenny's eyes on me.
It's a very comprehensive list. You did a great job.
Thank
Thumbs
you.
up.
Thanks.
I think the only other thing is I just want to reiterate that all of this is directly in the narrative. So
Yes.
when we're talking about all of this, this is what the actual narrative is going to look like. This is, the exposition part of the story in the descriptions of the action. So this is not like, like when Carly mentioned internalizing all of, showing us all of their internal thoughts. In deep point of view, you don't italicize those thoughts, or you don't need like a tag on them that says like,
She thought.
Yeah. So, your narrative itself is what's going to be is what is going to reflect this deep point of view. So I just wanted to reiterate that.
And then you don't have to put everything into dialogue, which can
Right.
be really difficult.
Right. It can sometimes, though, I think, feel like you're telling more than you should be when you're writing in deep point of view, because you are like telling us the thoughts that they're having, and you think you're supposed to show everything, but there always has to be that balance of showing and telling.
Totally.
Which we need to do an episode about at some point. Show and tell.
I think we did.
Did we? I do this frequently.
I think we did.
Okay.
But I could be wrong.
Okay, we probably did, and I'm just like,
I don't know.
what are old episodes? I don't know.
We'll find out when we are done. We'll check on that.
Okay, so deep point of view is not for every story. There are definitely some stories that do not work well with deep point of view. So one big limitation of deep point of view is that nothing can happen outside of the narrator's point of view. So you might need multiple narrators, and then in theory, all the narrators would need their own voice, their own plot, their own character arcs, etc. So it's a lot more work when you write multiple characters who all have deep point of view. Mm-hmm. And so that's why earlier I said it's really better to limit deep point of view books that are written entirely in deep point of view to one or two narrators. This also means you can't describe things from an outside perspective or insert your own thoughts and feelings as the author. So sometimes, depending on what it is that you're writing, there are times that you might need to insert yourself a little bit as the author, and you can't do that in deep point of view. Something else to consider is whether you have an unlikable main character. Main characters need to be relatable and engaging, but that's not always the same as likable. So if you do have a main character who's unlikable, it might be harder for your readers to connect with like 400 pages of a character that they don't really like. So you a little bit more narrative distance there. I've also seen that in stories where like a villain is a main character. The main character is someone who is just really not a good person, sometimes maybe even an evil person. So like if the main character is a serial killer, for example, it might be a bit much for the reader to be in 300 or 400 pages of a serial killer's head, and you might want more narrative distance there.
Might be a bit much.
It might be. I mean, it depends on the reader,
That's true.
Similarly, there are times that you might not want your reader to connect as deeply with your character. So I've seen some multiple POV stories where the main character gets that deep point of view, and then there's a secondary character who gets a limited point of view, or maybe even a second point of view that's omniscient, in order to give the reader more of that outside perspective. So it's important to remember that there is rarely a right and wrong when it comes to point of view. It's really all about what serves the story, which is pretty much like everything else when it comes to writing advice.
Yeah, I feel like you could distill our podcast and just every 5 minutes have an auto repeated. But it depends on the story and what's best for you and your story, just on repeat.
It's true.
Because it's just so true for everything.
Here are the rules, except for when they aren't.
Here's best practices, but you don't have to listen to us. I bet you could do it better anyway. It's fine. Yeah.
Well, it all comes down to knowing what the rules and expectations are, so you can
is.
break them with intention, right?
Exactly. Gotta intentionally break the law. You don't want to unintentionally do it. That's no fun. All right. So There are a lot of common problems to look for when working with deep POV. So we've got filter words, head hopping, passive voice, too many dialogue tags, not enough interiority, etc., etc. There's a lot of things. So let's start with filter words. They're words that create distance and for the most part can just be plain old cut out. They're words like see and hear. So Jenny saw Carly talking in the podcast instead of just showing me talking.
Yeah.
Instead of telling us that your character sees a book on the shelf, just have them notice it and look at it and think about it. It brings us closer into their head, basically. Then you kind of want to go through and cut a lot of extraneous dialogue tags. You want to keep those to the minimum, only enough for clarity, or if you're using like action beats are really great for that, where you have someone move throughout the scene and that is used as a dialogue tag. But one of the big ones is watching out for passive voice. So instead of the world acting on your character, you want your character to act on the world. They're the ones making the decisions and doing the things, and your reader is in their head, so they should feel that activeness as well. So that it sounds very broad, but what it really kind of comes down to is instead of saying the door slams shut, your character should slam the door shut. It's them doing it instead of it just happening into the void. So things like that will kind of help tighten it and get us into your character's body, basically. Then you need to watch out for head hopping, which Jenny kind of mentioned, where the reader gets to see something that the main character doesn't.
Yeah.
It can be something even really, really minimal, like knowing that another character in the room is curious about how much a book is worth.
Yeah.
How would the main character know that the other person is wondering that? If they maybe notice them checking for a price tag, or know them well enough to know that every time they pick up something valuable, they wonder how much it's worth, then that's fine and maybe. But otherwise, we're seeing into the head of someone else there. We're getting to know what they're thinking and doing without watching it from our main character.
Yeah, something else that can kind of be head hopping is where you hop from the that deep point of view into an omniscient point of view.
Yes.
Which is essentially what happens when you tell us something that the character couldn't know. So, for example, I was just thinking as you were talking, this is something I catch a lot when I do copy edits, which is when you're writing in a deep point of view, you can't know if you are blushing or not.
Yes.
You can feel your face flush. You can feel like the heat come into your cheeks. But blushing is the change of color. And so you can't know whether a character can't know whether they're blushing or not. So if you're writing in first person, you can't say like, I blushed, unless you're looking into a mirror at the time.
Please don't have your characters look into mirrors to notice things about themselves. It is a huge pet peeve.
I think it just made me think when you said it could be really small things. It was the thing that popped into my head about,
right.
That's something that's so small that you wouldn't think of as being, something outside of point of view, but that is kind of technically head hopping into like an omniscient point of view at that point.
It is. Or like if they walk out of the bathroom and don't know that they have toilet paper stuck to their shoe, we can't know it until it gets pointed out to them. Things like that.
Yeah.
It's your character has to know it for the reader to know it.
Right. You can't ever use, so sometimes I see phrasing that's like that. That's like, what they didn't know was, or they didn't notice the blank, or
unknowingly.
Yeah. In deep point of view, you can't have those.
Nope. Cannot. Please don't. And yes, please don't have them look in the mirror to describe the color of their hair. Please. All right. So, Jenny, you made me lose my train of thought, but...
Sorry. We were talking
Okay.
about focusing on your main
Focusing.
character, their interiority.
Their interiority.
Yes.
So you need a lot of focusing on their interiority in order to build a connection with the reader. If you don't have that interiority, how do they know how your character is feeling and why they're feeling that way? That's the whole point of this deep POV. So make sure you really, really focus on that to build that connection. And that leads us to our final common problem. And that is kind of how it works with voice. So voice is one of those tricky things. It can feel vague or ephemeral or just confusing because everyone throws this word around a lot. But it's basically all about showing your character's personality and how they see things, who they are. So if they don't have a strong personality, the deep POV is going to likely fail because there's nothing for the reader to really latch onto.
Right.
It's kind of what I was saying of like, you don't want them to be a blank insert for your reader. They are a character. And so we need to be able to latch onto that voice and have a strong voice to get to know them. We're not them, we're their best friend.
Right.
Does that make sense?
And I think it's important to make sure. So a couple of things I want to clarify. One, strong voice, strong personality does not necessarily mean like physically strong or mentally strong.
Thank you. Yeah.
Quiet people have very strong personalities.
They do.
It's really just about really letting us know who this person is, what's important to them, how they think, how they react, all of those things.
Yep.
And kind of along those same lines, when we talked about what I totally just lost what I was saying in the middle of saying it.
Oh, no. Strong personality,
I don't know.
voice. Oh.
Yeah, and it's gone now.
Yeah, and we're coming
I think I did this in the last episode too. So yeah, I don't know. There was something else that was similar though. That we were talking about things being strong or not strong. I don't know. But it's something similar along those lines that when we talk about, you know, something being strong, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking like physical strength.
Yes.
Or
We're
like not everybody has to be like tough as nails kind of character.
Active versus passive character.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say, yeah, we just had to talk it out a little bit.
Yeah, we got there.
I was going to say, we mentioned like fun, quirky characters. So when I say fun and quirky, I'm also talking like fun and quirky does not necessarily mean like lighthearted or funny. Quirks can be dark, you know, fun. Dark is fun. I love dark characters.
Me too.
So I mean, fun and quirky in terms of, you know, having like this personality that has a lot of unique parts of it. That
quirky doesn't mean clumsy either.
Yes.
Everyone, please. There's more to quirkiness than being clumsy.
Yes. So just, you know, I know sometimes when you are writing advice, it's easy to pick out specific words and kind of cling to them. So, you know, fun and quirky characters, lighthearted characters, dark characters, strong characters, quiet characters. What matters the most is that we really know who the character is, what they're all about, and that's coming through clearly in the narrative.
Yeah. I think maybe instead of strong voice or strong personality, we should say a lot of personality or interesting personality, maybe.
Yeah. I think still it's just
work.
I think it's hard because when we talk about real people in that way, when we say like someone who has a lot of personality, where you're normally talking about someone who's over the top, someone who has a really big personality.
No,
you know, true. But that's not always the case. It really is. The quiet ones you have to watch out for.
It's true. All right. Well, I think that comes to the end of this episode.
Yes.
So this month, our query also sounds like it has a lot of suspense. So Jenny, what are your thoughts on the query?
You know, it always surprises me how we do this query thing as a random drawing. And yet somehow there are often these strong connections between our movie of the month and the query that we get.
I'm starting to think you're doing it intentionally because you're the one that draws the winner.
I'm not, unless I am like somehow like sending vibes from the movie into the cosmic mind of the universe that controls the random drawing process.
Maybe you're a vibe witch.
It's possible. And I only affect Rafflecopter.
Yeah. Only affect Raffles. Great.
Yeah, so this story has such similar themes in terms of isolation, loneliness, and even escaping into another world, like to feel needed and appreciated. So beyond that, I think there's a lot to love in this query. I really like that the main character's emotional wound is front and center. It's really integral to this story, and we can see that right away in this query. If we didn't know about her loneliness and her need to escape, and then how she creates this world from her own personality traits, it'd be a lot harder to see why this conflict is happening, what it means to the main character, and why she needs to be the one to resolve it. I also kind of love this meta look at what it's like to be an author and how you put your own life into your stories, even when it isn't really overt. That kind of write what you know thing. So I think this is why fiction is so cathartic for so many people. Like, it really helps us work through our own inner turmoil, and that's really what's at the heart of this story. So in terms of overall effectiveness, this query is pretty strong to me. What did you think?
Honestly, agreed. It's a really solid query. My one thing I would consider is moving the first paragraph down to just above the bio section. So the first paragraph in this one has all of those like nitty gritty details that an agent needs to fully understand the story, like word count, genre, comps, things like that. And it is perfectly fine for it to be at the top. However, in some cases, it's better to move it down. So with this one, if you move that one down, you'll start with a stronger hook if we start with the second paragraph, because that's when we really get into the story. So that second paragraph is going to pull us into the story instead of front loading the query with all of those details. But like I said, it really depends on the query. I think that's definitely helpful for this one. While sometimes the other way is preferable, some agents prefer it. It can be up in the air, but I think it can be really behoove you in a story like this to kind of grab the agent and pull them in really quickly instead of starting off with that information. Other than that, I think this is great. It's really solid. All right, so we have come to the end of the podcast. Next month, we'll be watching the sci-fi movie Alien, and we will also have another query or blurb critique. So if you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or many other streaming services. We actually just signed up to be available on Audible, so you can get us on Audible now. Yay. And also Amazon Music. So while you're there, please leave us a rating. You can see this month's query in its entirety and support the show at patreon.com/storychatradio. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at storychatradio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.